This is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5-Watt World. We're interested in helping you get the most music from the least gear. The first year of the Sunburst Les Paul, a new semi-solid ES335 guitar. The Les Paul Jr. and Special morphed into completely new double cutaway style. 1958 was a big year for innovation at Gibson guitars, with rapid evolution built on decades of experience. But, as if from outer space, breaking every rule of guitar design known to our primitive terror and understanding, the Explorer and Flying V were introduced. It was an important year for the electric guitar, and maybe the year that was most critical to the development of not only the modern Gibson catalog, but to popular music for decades to come. However, the more eccentric history of the Flying V has long been hidden in the shadows of the Les Paul and ES guitars. Today, that changes, because this is the 5-Watt World short history of the Gibson Flying V. If you enjoy our videos, take a minute to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified when we put out new videos. And if you've already subscribed, swing by the store and grab a t-shirt or a mug to support what we're doing here. There's a link in the description. Orville Gibson was born in 1856 in upstate New York near the Canadian border in the small town of Chateauguay. By the 1880s, he was building musical instruments in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and by 1895, he had become a true manufacturer of instruments. By the late 20s and into the 30s, guitars were becoming more popular, and the designer of the F mandolin, Lloyd Loar, designed the L5, which had the innovation of F-holes in the top. In the years to come, to meet the demand for more volume, the guitars grew larger, with the Super 400 ultimately being introduced in 1934. It was around the same time that Gibson sold its first electric guitars in the form of lap steel or Hawaiian guitars, and its first F-hole body electric guitar, the ES-150. The ES stood for Electric Spanish, as the guitar was designed to sit on your lap in a more traditional Spanish guitar way, and it differentiated it from the lap steel guitar so popular at the time. Today, the ES-150 model has earned the moniker of the Charlie Christian guitar, for the man who made such a mark playing that model with Benny Goodman. In 1944, the Chicago Musical Instrument Company bought a controlling interest in Gibson, and while manufacturing remained in Kalamazoo, the new sales and administration headquarters moved to Chicago. Ted McCarty had joined the company the year before, in 1948, after leaving Wurlitzer. Initially hired as general manager, he was promoted to company president in 1950. And so, Ted was already president of the largest instrument manufacturing company in the U.S. when the upstart Leo Fender offered his first odd-looking, solid-body Spanish-style guitar in 1950. Though initially dismissive of Fender's efforts, it didn't take Ted and company long to realize that a solid-body guitar had merit, and in 1952, they released the Les Paul. As we approached the start of our story in 1957, the pressure from Fender's rapid pace of innovation had Gibson feeling like something big had to be done to reassert itself as the industry leader. They'd watched the Stratocaster be introduced in 1954, and it had moved away from the traditional guitar shape with its more asymmetrical body and deep cutaways. It perfectly captured the mood in the country with the auto industry and their tail-fin flash 50s American design. They'd even capitalized on the space age theme with the guitar's name. Ted McCarty recalls, "Leo Fender was always downgrading us, which is why I was so fond of him. He was going around the country saying that Gibson was a stodgy old company, that we'd never had a new idea in our lives, that we were still making things like we did 50 years ago." So McCarty decided to climb in the ring with Fender, and in about the spring of 1957, his team came up with a plan to produce 3 new, modernistic models to put Gibson's dusty reputation to rest once and for all. The summer NAMM show was approaching, and Ted told the group, quote, "Let's make some guitars that are so outlandish they'll cause a stir at the show. We'll prove to Leo that we can make something different," end quote. The 3 proposed models would become known as the Flying V, the Explorer, and the Moderne. It isn't clear how many people at Gibson were responsible for guitar design, but when guitar historian Tony Bacon asked McCarty years later, Ted said that there were 3 or 4 plus himself all the time. Ted's main role in this seemed to be motivation and inspiration, something he excelled at. The team certainly included John House. He was McCarty's right hand, and he was in charge of production. Larry Allers, who was the company's chief woodworking engineer at the time, and one of the guitar players in the final assembly area, by which he was likely referring to Rem Wall. According to Gil Hembree's Gibson Guitars, Ted McCarty's Golden Era, Allers is perhaps the biggest unsung hero of the late 50s Gibson years. Allers was in charge of the whitewood shop, the pattern makers, and the machine shop. He organized the work on the modernistic guitars, selecting a pattern maker and giving him the instructions on what to build. According to Hemry, quote, "Not only did Larry supervise, explain, and coordinate, but also he would have done some of the most difficult handwork on the designs," end quote. When interviewing Seth Lover, the designer of Gibson's humbucking pickup, Lover told guitar historian Bacon that he had been deeply involved in the modernistic team as well. Lover pulled out an old Gibson catalog, pointed at the V and said, quote, "That's a body style I designed for them when I was at Gibson." Though it might be debated whether Seth Lover designed the V, McCarty recalls that it was Seth that named the guitar. McCarty said, "When Seth saw the first one, he laughed and said, 'Well, that looks like a flying V.' So that's what we named it." In June of 1957, Gibson filed 3 patent applications for the new designs. These were ornamental design patents and were simply illustrations of each guitar showing a front and side image of each. This was an unusual thing for Gibson, as they commonly filed invention patents for unique mechanical or electrical inventions, like their humbucking pickup. It seems that this was actually in reaction to Leo Fender having filed design patents for the Telecaster and precision bass designs. So McCarty seemed to believe that Fender might try to put out their own versions of these 3 new body shapes. As it happens, the V patent came in the last of the bunch. At the Summer '57 NAMM show in Chicago, a rough, early version of the Futura, which would later be named Explorer, was shown. There's just one photo of this Explorer style, an unfinished prototype that no one seems to know if either the V or Moderne were there at the '57 NAMM show. The best guess is that a V prototype was there so that McCarty could get feedback from the dealers visiting the Gibson suite. This dealer reaction often dictated if a guitar was put into production, and it's surmised that the V and Explorer did well, but the reaction to the Moderne was not as positive, and that's why the guitar was not produced. There's a prototype V that was made as a model for a case company, Gibb of Chicago, so that they could produce a custom case. The guitar surfaced in the 90s and was sold as an authentic Gibson guitar. It's different in that it has a black pickguard and a gold-colored Gibson logo. This guitar was eventually owned by Paul Allen of Microsoft fame. In the November '57 Gibson Gazette, Gibson's company magazine, only the V of the modernistic guitars was featured. The photo's authenticity has come into question and may have been in part an illustration. The guitar pictured has a dark finish, so it was perhaps built out of mahogany rather than the eventual Carina. There was a long neck heel that reached all the way to the 14th fret. The pickguard did not continue between the pickups. There was no pickup selector shown, and the raised logo was on an extended truss rod cover. According to the Daybook, the book listing all work done that day at the Gibson factory in Kalamazoo, the V began production on February 21, 1958. The book lists many instruments in production at the time: ES-355T, EB2, LP, Cherry Red, but at the very top of the handwritten list is Flying V in Carina. That March, Gibson released a new catalog, and in it there was a half-page showing the same photo illustration of the Flying V. The guitar listed for $247.50. The custom case was an additional $75. The price was exactly the same as the price of a Les Paul Gold Top, right about in the middle of the lineup price-wise. A contemporary Stratocaster listed for $274.50, and the Telecaster was a humble $199.50. Some dealers began receiving guitars later that month. The most obvious feature of the production guitar, besides the striking shape, is the use of Carina instead of mahogany. When asked why Carina was used, McCarty said that the blonde guitars were popular at the time, and that by using Carina, they could achieve the lighter finish. But this was also a popular look in the 50s mid-century modern furniture. Of course, Fender's Telecaster and Esquire had a blonde finish as standard, and at the '57 NAMM show, Fender had displayed a Stratocaster in blonde with gold hardware. The name Carina was actually a U.S. trade name for a West African hardwood usually known as limba. Limba is often compared to mahogany in terms of its average weight, tonal characteristics, and how it works in guitar building. Gibson also used Carina for their Skylark lap steel guitars in '57, so it's likely that they already had the exotic hardwood in stock at the factory. The V had 2 legs making up the V shape, and this had gently rounded ends and formed a slightly rounded crotch as well. There was a gentle sort of curving of the square shoulders where the neck joined the body. The front of the body was routed deeply to hold the pickups and the controls that were covered by the pickguard. And there was a narrow strip of ridged black rubber glued to the lower edge of the body. This was actually a bit of floor mat material and was glued there in the hope of keeping the guitar from slipping when playing it sitting down. The guitar had a one-piece Carina neck and followed the standard Gibson formula of a glued-in, tight mortise and tenon joint. But unusually in the V, the bodywood overlaps the neck heel at the back. There were 22 frets on a rosewood fingerboard glued to the face of the neck over a channel that held the metal truss rod. The truss rod adjustment was at the headstock. There were small pearloid plastic dot markers in the typical locations on the face of the fingerboard with corresponding small dots on the side of the neck. There was a white plastic nut fitted to the typical Gibson 24 3/4 inch scale length neck. The headstock was a 3-piece construction with a center section of 2 glued-on sides. It was a triangular design with 3 on a side Clousson tuners, with closed metal backs and plastic acorn-shaped buttons on a thin metal shaft. Between the tuners was a raised, silver-colored plastic Gibson logo, as was also used on some of the company's amplifiers. The serial number was inked on the back of the headstock, under clear lacquer, the first digit being either 8 or 9 to indicate the year of production. The V had the traditional 2 metal strap buttons, one attached to the inside of the upper leg and the other to the top body shoulder. The pickguard was made of triple-layer white plastic and was attached with 8 screws. Most of the electrical components were fitted to the underside of the pickguard. On the face of the pickguard were 2 volumes and a master tone control, and a 3-way selector switch. The 3 plastic knobs are now referred to as bonnet or top hat knobs. The knobs carried numbers from 0 to 10. The selector switch was next to the foremost volume knob. The control layout was a deviation from the typical 2-humbucker 4-knob layout seen on hollow body and jazz guitars from Gibson at the time. The PAF humbucking pickups were set in black plastic mounting rings attached to the body with 4 screws. The output jack was on the end of the lower leg, mounted in a ring of white plastic. There was a gold-plated zinc alloy Tune-O-Matic ABR1 model bridge with 6 brass saddles and 2 gold-plated zinc adjustment wheels. The wing-shaped tailpiece of gold-plated brass was designed specifically for the model and was later referred to as the Cadillac tailpiece because of the similarity to the car company logo. It was fixed to the body with 3 small brads, like upholstery nails. The strings passed through the body, through the stylish tailpiece, and up over the bridge. On the back were 6 string ferrules, similar to those you'd find on a Telecaster-style guitar. The optional case, built by Gib, was custom-built for the V, a long triangular shape with a flat tip and covered in the classic brown used for the higher-end Gibson guitars. Inside was either a red or pink plush lining, appropriate for what Gibson saw as an amazing creation. The 1958 NAMM show included 2 Vs. Though Explorers were beginning to be produced around this time, they didn't have any at the show, and clearly they were pushing the V in the displays and in the photo evidence from the show. Interestingly, the daybooks have a gap right at this moment in the company's history. It seems that the daybooks that contain everything after June 30th, 1958 through the 1960s have been lost. The book that could have told us so much about the history of the modernistic guitar production just isn't available, much to the frustration of guitar historians everywhere. Though the daybooks are missing, we have the end-of-the-year tally sheets done by the managers. The tally lists a total of 81 Flying Vs being produced in 1958. This is a very small number compared to the 434 Sunburst Les Paul shipped that same year. The final year entry for 1959 listed just 17 Vs. The modernistic guitars were a failure by any measure, and official production ceased with the guitars in 1959. In 1962-63, Gibson assembled a few from leftover parts, but finished them with contemporary parts like nickel-plated hardware and metal cap knobs. Most put the total production of original Vs at right around 100 guitars. In the early 60s, there was a renewed interest in the V, with Lonnie Mack and Albert King each playing them. Both men seem to have acquired an original V in the late 50s. Mack had a big hit with his instrumental cover of Chuck Berry's Memphis that took him and his V into the top 5 of the US singles chart. He'd had his original guitar fitted with a vibrato that required a bar be added across the legs of the V. Mack called his V number 7, always claiming that it was the 7th one to come off the line. Albert King also began using his V near the time the guitars were introduced. The left-handed player found the symmetrical shape ideal, and its humbuckers were perfect for his stinging blues style. He played a regular right-handed model on cuts like his late 60s Stax single, Born Under a Bad Sign. King would go on to play other Vs, including a true left-handed version built for him by famous luthier and repairman to the stars, Dan Erlewine. There's the well-known story about Dave Davies from the Kinks buying a V in 1965. On tour in the US, his guitar had been lost by the airline on the way to Los Angeles, so he went into a shop and went through a number of guitars before asking to see what was in a dusty brown case up high on a shelf. He left the store with an original 58, presumably one of the unsold failures from the original launch, for just $200. Davies went on to use that guitar on many appearances both on television and live in the States and back in the UK. He was constantly answering questions about what it could possibly be. By 1966, Gibson saw a growing demand for Vs and started to plan to put a new version into production. The new model was quite different from the original. It had different chrome-plated hardware, of course. The new guitars didn't have a string through the body tailpiece or the rubber edge strip for playing sitting down. They added a larger white pickguard and truss rod cover. It had a mahogany body and neck, a Tune-O-Matic bridge, and a Gibson Maestro Vibrola vibrato. They rearranged the 3 controls into a triangle formation rather than the original 3 in a row. This gave the guitars a quickly identifiable new look. The basic body and neck dimensions were the same with only small changes. Standard Gibson scale, 22 fret neck, rosewood board with dot markers, and the humbucking pickups that were now integrated into the pickguard. Zachary R. Festad and Larry Miner's book, Gibson Flying V, suggests that Gibson made 5 batches of 35 guitars each in the late 60s Vs, totaling 175 instruments shipped. The guitar first appears on the 1966 price list for $325 in Sunburst and $345 in Cherry Finish. By the final listing in '68, the price had risen to $375, and they offered them in Sunburst, Cherry, and Sparkling Burgundy. Interestingly, the reissued Vs didn't appear in any of the Gibson catalogs of the era. It's almost as if it was a side project that they didn't want to draw too much attention to. Of course, Jimi Hendrix decided for himself and came into possession of one of the new Vs in '67. Hendrix painted the guitar himself only a few days after buying it with all sorts of psychedelic designs. He used the psychedelic V as his main blues guitar from about August '67 to January '69, when he gave it to bassist Billy Cox. Hendrix then immediately got a Sunburst V from Gibson, while they built him a custom left-handed black V, which arrived around January 1970. A brief but notable sighting in 1969 was Keith Richards playing a '50s Carina V that he had acquired that summer. He famously played the guitar at the Stones concert in London's Hyde Park, just days after Brian Jones had died. Perhaps associated with that loss, he never used the guitar much again alive until it was stolen along with other gear from his temporary residence in the Côte d'Azur in France in 1971. Before forming ZZ Top in 1970, Billy Gibbons was in the band The Moving Sidewalks. He'd been playing a Strat, but was interested in trying an old Gibson with humbuckers. A friend called and asked him if it had to be a Les Paul. Gibbons replied that it just had to have, quote, those big pickups, end quote. It turned out to be a 1958 Flying V, a guitar even rarer than a burst Les Paul. Gibbons recalls, quote, I said, what is that? But I said I didn't care. It's got those pickups. So I bought it for $300. And sure enough, man, we stepped into the land of humbucking. It was really wicked. He continued to play that V for a good many years, even after he had acquired his famous burst named Pearly Gates. I remember buying ZZ Top's Fandango in the late 70s from a remainder bin in a local department store. The top right corner was clipped so that it couldn't be sold at full price anymore. I was just getting interested in electric guitar, and the half studio, half live album ran me over like a train. Gibbons has said that the V is all over the live side, and it is clearly visible on the cover of the album. Back at Gibson, the Flying V was about to have a new advocate in Bruce Boland. Boland had joined the company in the 60s as an instrument demonstrator and slowly gained more responsibility. By the '68 NAMM show, Boland was out promoting the new Gold Top and custom Les Paul single-cut reissues. But Bruce had a feeling that the world was ready for another V. So he came up with the idea of doing a limited run that they'd called the Medallion. The model was only produced in '71 and was very similar to the '67 model with its large pickguard, triangular controls, and mahogany construction. There was no vibrato, and the most obvious difference was a metal medallion on the top leg of the V. The medallion had the Gibson logo and limited edition model and was individually numbered. This would be the first limited edition run that Gibson did. Shipping logs show that the limited numbers exceeded all the previous runs of Vs, with 350 guitars produced in 1971. Mark Boland from the band T-Rex played a late 60s style V, and Kim Simons of the British blues band Savoy Brown played a 67 style V as well. Over time, Boland phased out the V, but when the instrument sold at auction in 2007, it fetched 36,000 British pounds. Michael and Rudolf Schenker formed the band Scorpions in the late 60s, with their first album being released in 1972. When playing early on with the Scorpions, Michael had an emergency and had to borrow a guitar from his brother. The guitar he borrowed was a '71 Medallion V that he plugged into a 50-watt Marshall, at which point he knew he'd found his sound. Schenker said of getting used to the guitar, quote, it's awkward at the beginning, but then it just becomes second nature. And then it becomes the other way around. It becomes awkward if you have to play a normal guitar. As Schenker's career gained steam, he owned a number of Vs, but always on the late 60s, early 70s triangular control style. Known now for playing Vs with a signature white and black finish, but this too came about via another emergency. He and his brother had cherry Vs, and so he decided he'd strip off the lacquer finish so his would be a natural. By the time his amateur efforts were complete, he'd put all kinds of gouges in the wood. He had a tech fill in the deep gouges, and when he came time to repaint it, he said, I didn't know if I should play a black V or a white V. So I asked him to spray the guitar black and white, and that was it. He now plays a Dean custom model V-style signature guitar. K.K. Downing of Judas Priest was also there in the early 70s metal scene, but he says that they considered themselves a progressive blues band. As such, they'd been greatly influenced by Savoy Brown's Kim Simons playing a V. He'd also seen Albert King play live in London and was blown away. He also pointed to Schenker as an influence both on the use of a V and of his tone. Downing bought a 67 V in a music store in Birmingham for £500, a lot of money at the time. He traded his SG and all the cash he could find to get it. He went on to get a backup for the 67, a 71 Medallion model. In the early 80s, he played custom Hamer Vs, but in 2005, Gibson released a limited edition Judas Priest Flying V. By 1975, Gibson had moved its solid body manufacturing to the new plant in Nashville. That year, they began building a 67 style V, and it ran a good long while, lasting in the catalog until 1982. The specs were very similar to the Medallion model. Other makers were their own short history videos. Jackson and Charvel were also building their own style V guitars at the time. In 1981, Gibson released the V2, a very unusual vision of a V, with V-shaped pickups and unusual beveling along the multi-laminate body's edge. It was like the mating of a classic guitar and a boomerang. The guitar was gone from the catalog by 82. You know the saying, if it's so good, why isn't there a version 2? Well, that's why. By 1982, Gibson had come around to needing their own V in the line again and issued a V in their Heritage line of guitars. The guitars were shown at the NAMM show in Atlanta. Oddly, though the guitars were built out of Carina like the originals, besides the natural finish, they were also offered in solid colors, which had not been offered in 1958. In 1984, Gibson released a V without a pickguard, with the controls in a curving line, and that was their main V model until the end of the decade. Gibson's first custom shop had been the Kalamazoo factory in the 60s, and in the early 80s they revived the idea in Nashville. The first guitar builder they hired was Phil Jones, who went to work there in June of '84. Jones made prototypes and one-off guitars, including a left-handed Flying V for Paul McCartney. Inspired by the recent work of the Heritage Les Pauls, Jones started working on a special project to recreate a proper, accurate reissue of the original Vs and Explorers. Jones was keenly interested in 50s design, particularly furniture design from the era and its influence on guitar design. Jones says of the original Vs, quote, "To me, and maybe one or two other people, I think, sound-wise, the Carina Flying V is one of the most outstanding solid-body guitars ever," end quote. He believes that a great deal of this is attributable to the string through the ferrule design, like on a Telly, that leads to all the sustain. Gibson issued the reissue as the 58 Carina Flying V in 1991. In '94, it was put under the umbrella of the Gibson Historic Collection, bringing them in line with the custom shop reissue program Les Pauls being made at the time as well. Which brings us back to the beginning in a way. I had a chance to speak with Phil Jones last week, but it wasn't about a new reissue V. It was actually about his role in authenticating the very first V prototype in September of 2019. When I put up the Les Paul short history video, I was contacted by a member of 5 Watt World who said he had a good Gibson story if I wanted to hear it. As you can imagine, I immediately called him up. He proceeded to outline how he'd purchased a guitar in 1990 that he'd recently verified was the very first Flying V prototype, and that he had the guitar authenticated with the help of the good folks at Groom Guitars in Nashville. This prototype had been sent to Gieb, Gibson's case maker, and they had suggested that if the headstock was an inch and change shorter, it could fit into one of their current case shapes. It seems Gibson complied and built another V prototype, the one we all thought was number one for over 60 years, the one that was likely taken to the NAMM show in 1957, the one famously owned by Paul Allen, but that was actually the second V. I love this stuff. This is why I enjoy researching and making the short histories. Because just when you think you knew enough, you find out that there's a little more to the story. I need to thank Phil Jones for taking the time to talk to me about the recently discovered first prototype V. It was an honor to talk to someone so steeped in Gibson history. This video would not have been possible without Tony Bacon's excellent book, Flying V Explorer Firebird. Getting a thank you email from Tony after the SG video has been one of the highlights of doing this series for me. I need to thank Walter Carter and John Roncolato at Carter Vintage Guitar in Nashville for sharing the high-res pics of some of their beautiful Vs, in particular the original 58 that's currently for sale at Emerald City Guitars in Seattle. I need to thank the folks at Wildwood Guitars for the use of the pic of the V in the thumbnail. And I further need to thank the folks at Wildwood for their permission to use the Flying V playing of the one and only Gristle King himself, Greg Koch, over the intro and outro of the video. I can't think of another player that has so effectively yet seamlessly tucked his jazz guitar training into the vocabulary of glorious blues and rock tones. And finally, as is often the case, I need to thank my editors, Perry McManus and Dave Honorato, for bringing their knowledge and style to the betterment of the script, and to all things 5 Watt World. If you have your own Flying V story, please share it in the comments and let me know what I missed. I know I can count on you. Thanks for watching. Remember, if you want to further support the videos, stop by the store and grab a t-shirt or a mug. The link's in the description. Oh, and if you're still watching, we love to get pictures of members of 5 Watt World wearing their t-shirts. You just might not have been in the video yourself. Until next time, thanks for being a part of the 5 Watt World.
Oh,